Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So another week, another month, and once again the BBC has got it horribly wrong with their Glastonbury broadcast with regard to Hamas and with regard to anti-Semitism. And once again, another grovelling apology. How long, Secretary of State, must this go on before, regrettably, many in the Jewish community and millions of the British people conclude that the BBC is institutionally anti-Semitic?
Well, I was going to thank him for that suggestion, but I think his views about the BBC are very clear. Those of us who support the BBC, who believe it's an incredibly important institution, however, will know that it should and does, in some instances, play an important role for all communities to be heard and feel valued as part of our public life. That is the standard that we expect the BBC to be held to. That is the standard that this government will hold them to. And we will not hesitate to take the action that we need to make sure that it does rise to meet those standards.
Andrew Murison.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Congratulate the Secretary of State on her statement. Normalising, condoning, tolerating, the kind of things that we saw at Glastonbury over the weekend, history tells us never ends well. It ends extremely badly indeed. As a neighbouring MP, I have written twice to Worthy Farm with my concerns about Kneecap, following reports of one of its members advocating the killing of MPs. No reply, none expected. Instead, it schedules Bob Vylan, who we heard also advocates killing people, this time Jews. Does the Minister agree that it is no good Glastonbury's very wealthy organisers banging on about their festival being a safe space for everyone, whilst it continues to facilitate operations like this?
Well, I share his concerns about how this was able to happen, and I am sorry to hear that he has had no response at all to very serious concerns raised in a capacity as a democratically elected Member of Parliament for people in the area who deserve answers. That's something I'm certainly happy to follow up on his behalf and with him after this statement. I share his view that festivals, music festivals in particular, must be safe and inclusive and welcoming spaces. And I fear that we fell way short on this occasion. I visited Glastonbury myself before. I know that it provides an incredible showcase for a lot of British artists, not just those at the top of their game, but up-and-coming British artists as well. But as the organisers rightly acknowledged, a line was crossed this weekend, and that must not be allowed to happen again.
Gregory Campbell.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Secretary of State for her statement and the sentiments contained therein. But would you agree with me that in the run-up to the festival, it was very clear to many of us, given the track record of some of the participants, that this was going to happen or something like it was going to happen. The government were aware something was going to happen. The BBC were aware something was going to happen. And still it happened. Where does the sanction lie? And who is going to implement the sanction? And when are we going to know what it is?
Well, can I thank him for that? I mean, I agree very much with the sentiment that much of this was foreseeable. None of us could know precisely who was going to say what, but I think even a cursory glance at Google could tell you that this particular artist has a history of provoking very extreme statements and behaviour, particularly in relation to the events in the Middle East. I don't think it would have been too difficult to foresee that, and I think there are therefore serious questions to answer about the issues around live streaming, about due diligence and other factors as well. Those are questions I expect a response from the BBC on, and the action that they will take in order to ensure that this does not happen again. If those answers aren't forthcoming, I do have various levers in order to hold the BBC to account, and I want to be clear with him and with the House that I will not hesitate to use them if I need to do so.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What we saw was an appalling pro-terrorist broadcast on our national broadcaster, because when you chant, kill the IDF, you're endorsing those who kill them. And those who kill them are Hamas. So it was an endorsement of the terrorism of Hamas. And yet the BBC deliberately chose not to cut the broadcast. Perhaps therefore it's time for government to consider cutting the licence fee.
Well, this government's view of Hamas is clear. They are a terrorist organisation. They are banned in the UK, and there is a good reason for that, and we will continue to be outspoken about that and to be robust in relation to them. That is one of the reasons why I was very concerned to hear that there may have been imagery, symbols and graffiti in support of Hamas at the festival this weekend, and one of the reasons why we will not hesitate to make sure that we deal with that and get to the bottom of that in order to stand with our Jewish communities and with everybody in this country who stands against Hamas and is at risk from them. In terms of the BBC licence fee, he will know that this government supports the BBC. We believe it is an important institution. That is why we are so disappointed that this has happened, why we have been so exasperated with the lack of account from the leadership, not just about this, but about a previous Gaza documentary and a number of other issues as well. The BBC is one of the most important institutions in our country, and that is the reason why it is held to the highest of standards, why it's essential that we hold it to the highest of standards as we seek to start the charter renewal process, which should safeguard the future of the BBC, not just for the next 10 years, but to put it on a solid footing for decades to come. These are questions that we are determined as a government, collectively with the BBC and all members of this House, to grip.
Dr. Peter Prinsley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for her excellent statement. The murder of hundreds of Jews at the Nova Music Festival in October 2023 sparked this war. The irony of broadcast anti-Semitism at Glastonbury here in the UK is not lost on any of us. So how are Jews, such as myself, in this country to be reassured about the editorial processes at the BBC, and who on earth will be held accountable for this error?
He makes an extremely important point about accountability, and that is something that is not lost on me as the Secretary of State, and something that I've impressed upon the BBC leadership as well. When you have one editorial failure, it's something that must be gripped. When you have several, it becomes a problem of leadership, and so I very much take his point about that. On the point that he raises, though, about the parallels between, not the parallels, sorry, but the strength of feeling that people have about this, given that it was happening, this was a music festival, and it was at a music festival on the 7th of October where so many young people lost their lives, others kidnapped to never return to their families, and some still being held hostage. At that moment, this would have been the perfect place to express support, love and solidarity with those who are still suffering. And I know that there were those at the festival who were doing precisely that, but they were hindered in that by some of the appalling scenes that we've seen. And that's why we are determined to grip this and to make sure that music festivals are a safe and inclusive space for everybody. As a government, we're also reaching out to other music festivals and to Glastonbury to see what more we can do to express solidarity with those who are still suffering as a consequence of the appalling events that happened on the 7th of October, and to see what we as a government can do to support those efforts.
Oh, Glenn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank Secretary of State for what she said? I agree with virtually everything she has said. When I heard these reports, I thought of the Mayor of Wilton, Councillor Alexandra Boyd, who is Jewish. And I thought about what it would have felt like for her to have watched this with her family. Can I say to the Secretary of State, I think we all in this place understand the fine editorial judgments that the BBC and their staff have to make. But this is of a completely different order. And when people are losing faith in the great institutions of this country, could I urge the Secretary of State in her follow-up conversations that the BBC actually identify accountability to individuals. My honourable friend has set out very clearly the guidance that exists. Somebody didn't follow that guidance, and I think the country expects people to be held individually to account for why they failed to do their job properly.
I think people do expect people to be held to account for the way that they do their jobs, be that on the front line or at senior levels. It's a point that I've made to the BBC. They will have heard what he said and what my honourable friend said as well about accountability, and it's a point that I will continue to press.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I have always been a strong advocate for the BBC. It is a cornerstone of British public life with a proud history of cultural contribution. The events of this weekend, however, have made this incredibly difficult. During the coverage of the festival, the artist, as we've heard, real name Pascal Robinson Foster, led the crowd in a chant of death to the IDF, a moment which extraordinarily was transmitted by the BBC. Let me be clear, a national broadcaster funded by the licence payers must adhere to the highest standards of impartiality, responsibility and commitment to social cohesion. And I hope we can all agree that in this instance it has failed profoundly. Free speech and political activism are the sign of a healthy democracy, essential to it. But when you cross the line to incitement to violence, then there must be a consequence. However, broadcasting is not a passive act. Every second of broadcast transmitted is an active choice. Airing Robinson Foster's hateful rhetoric wasn't just a lapse in editorial judgment. It was a disgraceful affront to the Jewish community and a violation of the BBC's own public charter and to entertain without undermining the fundamental values of our society. As the Secretary of State said, let us be clear that hateful rhetoric should never be cloaked as artistic expression. But it also raises fundamental questions about the BBC's institutional culture. This is a broadcaster that has time and again given airtime to representatives and supporters of Hamas while refusing to clearly identify the group as what it is, a terrorist organisation. It has repeatedly failed to call out anti-Semitic rhetoric when it emerges under the guise of political commentary, and has faced serious allegations of minimising attacks on Jewish communities. The BBC's decision to also broadcast material from Kneecap, a group whose members have openly called for members of Parliament to be killed, is as indefensible as it is shocking. We have already seen the devastating consequences of political violence in this country, with the loss and the tragic murder of Joe Cox and Sir David Amis. For the BBC to amplify voices advocating similar violence is grossly irresponsible. Even more troubling is that a leading member of the group is currently facing a terrorism charge. That fact alone should have prompted an immediate editorial intervention. Instead, the BBC gave this group a platform on a publicly funded service. I welcome the fact that the Secretary of State has spoken to the Director General, and I'm grateful to her for coming to the House to report on that exchange. However, I would like to press her further to ensure the gravity of this matter is fully recognised. Is she satisfied with the BBC's explanation that they originally decided that streaming the performance was in line with their editorial guidelines and have now decided they will look at their guidance around live events so they can be sure teams are clear on when it is acceptable to keep output on air? Does she think the BBC's editorial guidelines were not clear enough, or does she think that the BBC misinterpreted them in the first place? And does she think that this sort of weak response will be of cold comfort to the Jewish community? I welcome the fact that she has spoken to the Home Secretary, and I wonder if she could also assess whether the BBC's actions constituted a breach of Section 22 of the Public Order Act. And does she believe the BBC's current editorial oversight mechanisms are adequate, specifically across the commercial broadcasting arms like BBC Studios? And does she think it is still right that the BBC gets to mark its own homework in the first instance before Ofcom get involved, and that an independent inquiry is what is needed? And in light of the repeated failings, will the government commit to a full review of the BBC's impartiality and governance standards as part of the Royal Charter renewal? And can she provide an update to the House on why the Charter renewal framework and Green Paper have not yet been published? Finally, can I thank her for her work so far? She will have the support of this side of the House, and I welcome her commitment to come back to the House to update us.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wish we lived in a world where there was no chanting of death. Any form of racism is vile, be that Islamophobic, anti-Semitism, or any other kind. The Secretary of State will probably recall only last year in November the Israeli football fans, which were chanting death to all Arabs. And more sickening perhaps, there are no schools in Gaza because there are no children. That kind of speech and chanting must equally be condemned. And what's sad is that whilst we have a ministerial statement here today, we did not have any ministerial statement when that chanting happened. It's the hypocrisy which is causing an outrage in the British public. Does the Minister not agree that that is what's happening out there in the community?
Could not disagree more. And I would just say to him that, of course, absolutely, I think every member of this House will utterly condemn chants of death to all Arabs. It's disgusting and disgraceful. It's a principle by which we hold ourselves. And there is no hesitation from anybody in this House. The reason I've brought a statement to the House today is because our national broadcaster, which is funded by the licence fee, which is paid by the public in this country, has broadcast something that is deeply, deeply offensive to a community in this country that has made many, many people feel and may actually have made them unsafe. That is the most serious thing that you can imagine. It is rightly a question for government, and that's why I didn't hesitate to bring it to the House today. If this had been a broadcast that had led with the chant that he describes, broadcast by the BBC, you would be having the same statement at this dispatch box and you would be getting the same response from other members of the House. And can I just say to him that it does, as somebody who has stood up for the Palestinian cause for the last nearly best part of 2 decades in this House, especially when it was hard, and especially when it was unpopular, and especially when it cost me friends and colleagues, and has stood alongside many members of this House in order to highlight the plight of the Palestinian people. Can I just say to him that as a long-standing supporter of justice for the Palestinians, he does nothing for the Palestinian cause by aligning himself with anti-Semites.
John Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A blind man on a horse could see there was going to be difficulties broadcasting a band called Kneecap, named after a terrorist punishment. People who'd called for the death of people in this House, and we should take a moment here now to reflect on the fact that Eddie Neve and Ian Gow were both killed by Republican murderers. Is it not the case, however, that there is a pattern emerging here with the BBC, given the events of the weekend and given previous incidents, that will she at least test the idea that the BBC has a fundamental problem with Israel?
Secretary of State. Let me first of all recognise that the BBC has been criticised by all sides in this conflict for bias, which shows the very difficult editorial line that they have to walk. But let me also be clear that when it comes to what happened this weekend, as the BBC itself has rightly acknowledged, the coverage, the standards, the enforcement of those standards fell well short of what was expected. And let me acknowledge that that's not the first time in recent months that that's happened. Let me assure him that the government takes this incredibly seriously. We are having discussions with the BBC at the most senior levels in order to make sure that this is gripped. And as I said previously to other colleagues in the House, I do have levers at my disposal and I will not hesitate to use them should I need to.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think that anyone who witnessed the disgusting images of young, middle-class, educated morons chanting death to IDF soldiers at the weekend can only be alarmed that we've stooped to this level in our society. But even worse, the state broadcaster should then broadcast those images across the nation. And I welcome what the Minister has said today and the way in which she has said it. But if we look at what she has spoken about, she has called the director, she has asked for immediate explanations, and she's expecting answers. But given that the BBC has already ignored calls from this House to explain its bias, does she really expect that she's going to get any satisfactory answers from an institution which is anti-Semitic, I believe, at its very core? And does she have any confidence in any police investigation, given that the police have already decided not to prosecute the member of Kneecap who called for the killing of Tory MPs?
Well, the police have just announced in the last few minutes before we came into the chamber for this statement that there is now an ongoing criminal investigation. I think it's important that we allow the police to do their work. Of course, wouldn't hesitate to call the Director General of the BBC and ask for an explanation. I do expect that explanation to be forthcoming. I expect it to be satisfactory, by which I do not mean that I expect excuses about what has or has not been done in this instance. What I expect is a full and honest explanation of what has clearly gone wrong on this occasion, and a full explanation of what will be done, not through another review, not with months and months of delay, not by spending public money on trying to get to the bottom of what has gone wrong, but what will be done immediately to make sure that this cannot happen again.
Yeah.
Point of order, Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State